This week we have another installment in our leadership series, where we hand the mic to leaders at Scotiabank to interview experts on an issue that resonates with them. In this episode, the issue is rethinking the fundamentals of charitable giving.
Do you want to know why charities have not changed the world the way we hoped they would? Because that's not what we asked them to do.
That's our guest this episode, author, activist, and speaker Dan Pallotta.
What we asked them to do is keep your overhead and your salaries low. And so having an impact became entirely secondary.
And even long before his 2013 viral TED Talk on the subject garnered over 5 million views, he's been challenging how we think about charity.
I'll keep preaching to nonprofits collaborate. They don't see a reason to collaborate. It has to be in service of some daring, impossible, ridiculous, sends a shiver up your spine dream. It's not like nobody in human history has ever dared to dream impossible dreams. We just don't do them in the nonprofit sector.
Hosting the conversation is Nicole Frew. Nicole is the Executive Vice President and Co-Head of Global Banking and Markets in the U.S. at Scotiabank. She's also the Executive Champion of Scotiabank's Employee Giving Campaign. Nicole and Dan will talk about the problem with how we currently approach charity, the importance of dreaming big when it comes to this sector, and some practical questions people should be asking before they decide where to donate their time and money. I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Now here's Nicole Frew in conversation with Dan Pallotta.
Hi, Dan. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Really excited to have the chance to talk to you today about some of the challenges facing the nonprofit sector and how we maybe can go about thinking a bit differently. But before we do that, maybe you can tell us a bit about your career in the nonprofit sector and your first foray into activism.
Let's see. First foray into activism. Well, I grew up in the 60s. So, I was a little kid in the 60s when John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were around saying visionary things, but at the same time, the Vietnam War was happening. So on the one hand, there was this vision, and on the other hand, it was depressing and demoralizing. And then Apollo was going to the moon, so that was exciting. And I think the confluence of those things made me want to make a difference, but if I was going to make a difference, it had to be as big as going to the moon. It had to be as big as Apollo. First thing I did was I organized a group of students when I was the chair of the Harvard Hunger Action Committee, and 39 of us rode our bikes 4,200 miles across the continental United States to raise money and awareness for world hunger. And that journey was poetic, and it was difficult, and it was beautiful, and it never left me. And as I got a little older and began losing friends to AIDS and saw that the landscape for activism out there was limited to doing a 5K AIDS walk on a Saturday morning and going to get margaritas with your friends at lunchtime, it just seemed incongruent with the magnitude of what we were dealing with. And never forgot that journey, and so decided to create these long, difficult, epic journeys for the average citizen. So we created the AIDS rides, which were 4, 5, 6, 7-day bicycle rides from San Francisco to LA, or Billings to Missoula, Montana, across Alaska. Then we created the breast cancer 3-day walks, which were 60 miles in 3 days, and gave ordinary people a chance to explore their extraordinary heroism. And we raised almost $600 million in 9 years. It was more money raised more quickly for those causes than any events in history. 182,000 people participated. We were one of the very first Harvard Business School case studies on social enterprise.
Wow. It's really interesting to see how amazing leaders that you mentioned had such an impact on you, and how you in turn transformed that into having impact on others. Your TED Talk, which has 5.4 million views, The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong. It talks about how we need to completely rethink the approach to nonprofits. For our audience, how should we be thinking about charities? What are some of the foundational changes you think we need to make?
Yeah, well, in that TED Talk, I was asking sort of a rhetorical question, which was, do you want to know why charities have not changed the world the way we hoped they would? You want to know why breast cancer is still at the same level around the world that it was 30 years ago, why suicide rates are increasing, why illiteracy rates have remained static. Why haven't charities changed that? Because that's not what we asked them to do. What we asked them to do is keep your overhead and your salaries low. And as long as you keep your overhead and your salaries low, we will reward you with beautiful grades from our charity watchdogs and with praise from the government officials. And so having an impact became entirely secondary, because if having an impact meant your overhead was going to go up or you were going to need to pay higher salaries, forget about that, right? You're going to be crucified. So having an impact became secondary because you weren't rewarded for that. If you want to look at how things operate in the world, look at the incentives. And the incentives for charity are, don't try to make a big impact. That's risky and costly. And you could end up on the wrong side of charity watchdogs and government regulating agencies because of your experimentation. So I think that traditionally we've been taught as a culture, if you want to give to a charity, ask about their overhead and ask about their salaries. Now, some of us have begun a conversation over the last 15 years that has begun to change that inside the sector. I don't think it has reached the general public yet. And then we say, well, let's reinvent philanthropy or let's make the nonprofit sector more sustainable. Those aren't the things I'm interested in. I'm interested in, and I think at their heart, people who work for nonprofits are interested in, and I certainly think donors are interested in, ending these problems. How do we solve these problems? How do we end homelessness in our cities, and by when? How do we bring suicide down by 50% and by when? And then the next 50% and by when? What is it that we want to accomplish and by when? I think that's what has to drive nonprofit strategy, and that's what has to drive donors as well. Forget about the overhead. Forget about the salaries. Don't you want to solve problems? Then find organizations that you think are doing great work and ask them about their dreams. What are your plans to actually solve these problems, and give them the freedom to fail and to spend and to invest in order to pursue those impossible dreams the way big corporations pursue their gargantuan impossible dreams.
Two things that really resonated with me there is focusing on outcome. What's the outcome you want? And that word impact. And what gets recognized and rewarded gets repeated. And that whole concept of making sure we have the right incentives. So maybe help tease out a little bit more, because we talk about innovation as a bank. You just mentioned dreaming big, using innovation. What does innovation in the nonprofit sector look like? And maybe give me a couple of examples.
Yeah, I think innovation is a new idea, right? Novus, Latin, new. What's your idea? The slogan for TED is ideas worth spreading. And for their audacious projects, it's ideas worth funding. So what's the idea? So for example, take the One Love Foundation in the United States. They looked at domestic violence. And instead of let's figure out better ways to care for people who are victims of domestic violence when they're adults, let's go back. Let's start teaching kids in high school, maybe even earlier, certainly in college, about the warning signs of relationship abuse. Let's start teaching them how to have healthy relationships so that we're not dealing with the problem downstream 10 years later. That's an innovation. That's a new idea. Or last mile health. Okay, instead of building expensive brick and mortar hospitals and clinics in developing countries, let's arm digital community healthcare workers with apps and cell phones so they can go deep into these communities and treat 80% of the illnesses that don't require a brick and mortar hospital. All right, that's an innovation being brought to bear. Now, once you've got that innovation, okay, now you want that innovation to grow. And the trouble is we don't give nonprofit organizations money to grow. What is money to grow? It's money invested in fundraising. What is fundraising? It's being able to go out and get more people to give. But traditionally, we've taught charities, we don't want you to spend any money on fundraising. We want you to spend it all on the cause, which means they can't grow, which means they can't find new donors, which means they got to keep coming back to you year after year after year because you're not giving them the money to find new donors and to actually expand to the scale of the problem.
So I have the privilege of being part of the board of Big Brothers Big Sisters Toronto. And one of the things that you just mentioned was addressing a problem early. So one of the things Big Brothers Big Sisters Toronto focuses on is providing a meaningful and loving, caring adult to a child who has experienced adverse childhood experiences. Maybe if you could say to me, Nicole, here's one thing I would say that you could take back as a board member back to the organization you're working with to help continue that innovation in our communities.
So I would say there should be a declaration that no kid is going to be left behind, none of them. What does that mean for us? How big would we need to be? What would we have to spend on fundraising to raise that much money? Great, and let's fund that fundraising budget. Now, this brings up the question of capital because nonprofits don't distinguish capital. Everybody else in the world does, but nonprofits don't. They just think about revenue. And to the extent they have any notion of capital, it's what's in our petty cash. That's what they think of as their capital. That's not how someone who wants to open a bakery thinks about capital. They don't say, what do I have in my savings account? They say, what do I need to open this bakery? Let me go to the bank and get that much money. Nonprofits don't think that way. So I think one of the things that nonprofits need to do is begin to explore debt. And people gasp and fall off their chairs, and that's unethical. That's the way the whole world operates. That's how you bought your car. That's how you bought your house. That's how the country, the United States and Canada, have national debt. So let's say you determined if we had 10 new major gift officers, 4 years in, we could begin raising the amount of money we need to serve the entire addressable population. 10 new major gift officers. Okay, let's say we're going to steal from higher ed. We're going to pay them $200,000 a piece. That's $2 million a year. It's going to take them 3 years to produce any results. That's $6 million. So you go out and finance the $6 million. Or you find donors who would otherwise give and say, I got a better proposition for you. Loan us $6 million. There's a risk you could lose it, but loan us $6 million. Now, Susan Beresford, who used to run the Ford Foundation, said that nonprofit organizations have miniaturized ambitions, right? It's the no sector. We can't take yes for an answer. So I'll give you an example, because people think 10 major gift officers, he's off his rocker. Okay, I could see us hiring 1 or 2, but not 10. The University of Southern California, they've got about a $12 billion endowment. Took them 50 years to raise the first $6 billion. They raised the next $6 billion in 5 years. How did they do that? They doubled their major gift staff. Did they go from 10 to 20? No, they went from 270 major gift officers to almost 600 major gift officers. There is not a Health and Human Services agency in Canada or the United States that I know of that has close to even 60 major gift officers. They dream gigantic dreams. They package them for donors. They say, look, you could have this beautiful new law school with your name on it, this beautiful new hospital, this beautiful new medical center. Meanwhile, we're asking our board if we can have an extra $50,000 to hire a half-time development director. We are thinking way too small.
So, Dan, you mentioned USC, obviously a very large endowment, very big alumni network. What would you say to a smaller charity that doesn't have buildings that can be named after them, et cetera? How do they apply what you're saying?
I would say big thinking works, whether you're big or whether you're small. I would say big thinking is particularly critical if you are small. And remember, USC at one time was small. I'm not saying you've got to hire 270 or 600 major gift officers, but businesses that are very small go out and raise enormous amounts of capital. So I think even if you are small, I started the AIDS rides with $50,000, and 9 years later, we had raised $600 million. Steve Jobs started Apple in his garage. So don't be a victim of the fact that you're small. Start thinking big and think in sequences. How do I get to the next step? How do I get from that step to the next step? How do I get from that step to an even bigger step? Keep thinking forward. Keep thinking big.
So in the for-profit sector, and you talked a little bit about the differences between how for-profit and not-for-profit work, but many organizations make a conscious choice on social impact and where we want to lean in and support our communities. And for Scotiabank, we've really decided to focus on promoting economic resilience among disadvantaged groups. We have a $500 million commitment that we proudly refer to as Scotia Rise, where we are able to focus our efforts and remove barriers and support underserved communities in their education and employment prospects. And so for our listeners as donors, what should we all be thinking about when considering where we donate our funds? And back to that word impact, what will make an impact?
Yeah, I even think the word impact is a little abstract. It's way better than overhead, but it's still a little far removed. Like, we've got to get down to our grandparents' English. What problem do you want to solve and by when, right? Because that's ultimately what we want. And so what could donors ask? Ask your favorite organization, what are your goals? What you really want to find out is, what is your intention to solve this problem? Intention. Now, how can you measure intention? You can. Ask the organization, what are your goals? If they can't really tell you their goals, or if they speak in a word salad, you could say, I don't think you have an intention to actually solve this problem. What progress are you making toward that goal is a second question. If they can't tell you, if they aren't measuring their progress, that's another red flag. If they can tell you, great. And then how do you improve? Do you take the data that you're gathering and do you use it to change your operational behavior because you're learning how to solve the problem better? Those are the three questions. What are your goals? What progress are you making toward those goals? And how do you improve? And if they can answer those questions in a way that inspires you, great. If they can't, dig a little deeper or go somewhere else. But do not ask, what is your overhead? What do you pay your CEO? That tells you absolutely nothing about whether they're ever going to solve a problem. I can point to 100 charities that have super low overhead inside an ecosystem where the problem is getting worse.
So how do you have that conversation with donors to convince them those aren't the right things to be looking at?
Two things to think about here. First of all, a lot of people ask me, how do I get my donors more engaged? How do I get my board members more engaged? Stop boring them to death. Stop boring them to death with tiny little ideas that don't matter, with panic over whether you're going to meet next year's budget. Start dreaming a big dream that takes their breath away. You start getting them to focus on a big dream, on solving this problem by such and such a date, they're going to realize you need to spend more on things like overhead and salaries to get there. You're not even going to necessarily have to have any kind of an adverse conversation. And if you don't have a big dream, well, then that's all they're going to care about is, well, how much are we spending on the cause versus other things? The second thing is create a donor literacy program and get methodical and say, over the course of the next year, we are going to change the way everyone in our ecosystem thinks about these things. We're going to do it with our board. We're going to do it with our staff. We're going to do it with our major donors. We're going to do it with our volunteers. And we're even going to do it with our retail donors. And you have a 1-year program where you show them the movie Uncharitable, or you have them watch my TED Talk, or you have them read the Nonprofit Starvation Cycle article from the Bridgespan Group. You just get very methodical and you use tools that have been created, and we've created powerful tools for nonprofits to persuade their donors and board members.
So when it comes to charities, what's the most important thing from your perspective? Is it hope? Is it inspiration?
I'm a big fan of action. Talking about hope, it doesn't give you hope. Action is what delivers that spiritual excitement that we're all seeking. Dreams, like, you can be intellectually marginalized for talking about dreams. They're silly, they're sophomoric, they're not serious. We've got, urgent business to do right now. We can't luxuriate in dreams. Dreams are the most sophisticated things known to humanity. You look at the sophistication of the Apollo program, an impossible dream. A dream drives innovation. It doesn't happen the other way around. People aren't going to innovate when there's nothing to innovate for. A great dream drives collaboration. It doesn't happen the other way around. We keep preaching to nonprofits collaborate. They don't see a reason to collaborate. In service of what? It has to be in service of some daring, impossible, ridiculous, sends a shiver up your spine dream. It's not like nobody in human history has ever dared to dream impossible dreams. We have plenty of examples of them. We just don't do them in the nonprofit sector. And the key to a dream, the way John Kennedy ignited Apollo, was a joint session of Congress, seen now by the whole world. I believe this nation should commit itself to the goal before this decade is out. He said that in 1961, which means by 1970, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. Well, that started a wild conversation because we didn't even have a computer any more powerful than a calculator. We hadn't orbited the earth yet. That created a powerful conversation. You can't do it. We don't know how to get something that heavy into escape velocity. We don't know anything about the surface of the moon. We don't have the math. We don't have the materials technology. All of a sudden, the conversation starts to be populated by all the problems you would have to solve in order to get to the moon. You're now in a new conversation. If you don't set that deadline, guess what human beings talk about? The weather. Literally, we talk about the weather because there's nothing driving us to use the fullness of our potential, of our intelligence, of our ability to overcome conflict and all of the difficult things we would have to do to achieve these dreams. And sometimes when you talk about these dreams, your first inclination is it's exhausting. But I think what's really exhausting is thinking small, is not having enough resources, is doing the same thing over and over and over again that you already know how to do, that doesn't teach you anything new. That's what's exhausting. We've got it backwards.
Big dreams with big purpose.
Yeah.
What problem do we need to solve by when?
Scary question. It opens the doors to the dangerous world of the impossible. But, as Springsteen said in Blinded by the Light, Mama always said not to look into the eyes of the sun. But Mama, that's where the fun is.
Ideas worth spreading and ideas worth funding. You've given us both. Dan, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Nicole.
You've been listening to Nicole Frew, Executive Vice President and Co-Head of Global Banking and Markets in the U.S. at Scotiabank, in conversation with author, activist, and speaker Dan Pallotta. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.